Hyderabad, India, around the year 2000. It was around 3 a.m. The power was out, but it wasn't surprising because heavy rains would cause power outages quite frequently in those days. I woke up to the sound of my mother yelling, "Who's there?" from her room. I heard the clinking of utensils too, and judging by the tone of my mother's yelling, I suspected that we had a burglar breaking in. A car horn started blaring from outside. It wasn't a honk honk, but rather one super long honk. I was scared, so I threw my pillow at my brother, who was sleeping on the other side of the room, to get him to wake up, but he didn't budge. I decided to go to him, and the moment I stepped out of my bed, my feet went ankle deep in water. That's when it hit me that our house was getting flooded. I ran to my mom instead and started screaming something along the lines of "water in the house" in our local language repeatedly. Everybody woke up and we decided to evacuate to the floor above, which was still under construction but at least had a solid roof. My mom put us in charge of securing the important stuff like passports and documents. We underestimated how much the flooding would be and thought that putting the computer and all the important stuff on top of the cupboards would be good enough. We were wrong because about an hour and a half later, the entire ground floor was submerged. The area where we were living at the time had a lake about a kilometer away on one side and hills on the other. Our street, or colony as we called it, had about 5 to 6 houses next to each other with an average gap of 7 to 10 feet between each. Ours was the only one that had more than just a ground floor. My brother went to the roof to survey the scene, and he told us that most of the neighbors were also on their roofs. It was still raining heavily, so we decided to let all of the neighbors come into our house. There was no way that anybody could leave their houses from the front doors because the flood current was too strong. It had to be done via rooftops. 2 of the neighbors had ladders, and they were passed around until everybody had gotten to our house. After everybody was brought in, I counted around 40, some lady was crying to herself, and when asked to calm down, she revealed that she had forgotten the baby in her room. Everybody went quiet, and then 2 guys volunteered to go back for the baby. The baby was safely floating in his cot and was brought back. Everybody was scared, but after the baby was brought back, people started seeing the lighter side of things. At least from my perspective, it turned into one big party. I was certain that I didn't have to go to school the next day. All the guys who I played cricket with were with me, and we were talking about the whole incident all night. Early in the morning, a big bowl of rice was prepared, and everybody was just chatting and finally getting to know each other. The floodwaters receded by 4 p.m. the next day. The houses closer to the lake had gone even deeper, and the army had been deployed with boats to rescue them. Although there were no known casualties, the damage was just too much. The thing that hurt me the most was that we had lost our family's entire photo album collection. We had around 50 photo albums. Everybody spent the next week cleaning up and washing everything. I live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. We were here during the huge tornado that destroyed our town in 2011. We never thought anything about tornadoes. They're pretty commonplace here, especially in this town. I was at a friend's house. The local weather station was making a huge deal about this tornado getting closer and closer. My friends and I laughed it off, making jokes about being invincible. I opened the door to run out to my car for a jacket, and I was greeted by what can only be described as a solid black wall of wind and debris that sounded like a freight train. We all dove into a closet in the back of the house and held each other, thinking that we couldn't believe this was the end. About 5 minutes of completely unsettling silence later, we all caught our breath, and the house stopped shaking violently. I climbed over my friends and opened the door. You could see out the closet door for miles. All that was left of the 4-bedroom house was the closet. There wasn't a tree standing or a recognizable house or structure for miles. All that was left of my friend's home was the foundation, and that one closet. Almost a year to the day, Hurricane Sandy. I lived in Staten Island, New York, and relatively close to the beach. I had just gotten off from work somehow. I'm an EMT, and not even 5 minutes after getting home, around 8 p.m., the streets began filling with water. It was like a movie. I literally blinked and my room was starting to fill up with water. Within minutes, there were about 5 feet of water inside my room and the rest of the first floor of my house, and almost 6 feet outside. Getting my 2 dogs, my sister, my mom, and my dad, who can't walk very well, to swim in 5 feet of water in front of our house was pretty damn exciting, let me tell you. After that night was all said and done, we spent 15 days with no power, no heat, no hot water, nothing, and with the first floor of our house completely gutted out and empty. Not to mention there was a nor'easter that came a week after Sandy hit. That's just my own story. I won't even begin to get into what I dealt with at work that day and the following days. The original post with this story also had a comment that presumably asked a clarifying question, but the question was deleted for some reason. I'll read the response from the original storyteller. I'll start by saying that there are 3 hospitals on Staten Island, one of which is literally 2 blocks from the beach down in Zone A. We were responsible for partially evacuating all of the critical patients to a different hospital. Some patients who were able to be discharged were even brought to some of the many shelters set up at schools around the island. That took up much of the day, and the weather didn't really get bad until about 4 to 5 p.m. There hadn't been much other activity throughout that day. I didn't get mandated to stay at work, and I got off around 7 p.m., so anything on the streets at that point I couldn't really tell you much about firsthand. The next day, I left for work to find one of our ambulances a block away that was completely flooded out with the back windows smashed. Aside from that, there was an entire neighborhood that was off of the beach 75% underwater still. So my entire Tuesday consisted of being on standby with NYPD and Emergency Service Unit, while they went down street blocks and boats rescuing people out of their houses. We were there standing by to transport people to the hospital if needed. The things that we saw down there were unbelievable. Pulling people out of houses, giant houses that had collapsed, just an absolute nightmare. By Wednesday, we were down by a different part of the beach, part of the streets in the area completely inaccessible due to the streets still flooded out, and there were cars and houses that collapsed all over the place. We got a lot of calls out of houses in those areas, and we couldn't really get down there, which made it pretty difficult. But for the most part, things were semi-back to normal by Wednesday-ish. There was just no power in this whole Zone A part of Staten Island for 2+ weeks. The original storyteller also included this image to provide a little context. I was on holiday with my parents and little sister about 10 years ago in Italy, on a camping trip in a caravan, but with me sleeping in a tent. Suddenly, my dad came and woke me up, telling me to hurry out to the caravan. For some reason, he had woken up in the middle of the night, feeling something bad was coming, parked the car in front of the caravan, put our plastic boat on it, and put me inside to sit with my 8-year-old sister. Just then, a hailstorm came, with hail as big as fists coming from the sky, instantly breaking the windows in the bathroom that were on top of the van, the air vent above the bed where we sat, and the side window of the other bed, making nowhere safe from the hail and no trees to slow it all down. My mom was standing on the bed holding pillows against the holes above our heads, while my dad tried to get stuff stored away everywhere else. More stuff broke, so I put my sister under a blanket to keep her safe, and took over my mom's job so she could go help my dad. In the end, this took hours with one short break while in the eye of the storm. Going outside, everything was destroyed. I think I have a picture that my dad took somewhere when the elderly man across from us came outside and saw his destroyed plot for the first time. Our car was the only one whose windows were still okay thanks to my dad. We were very lucky, but being on a camping trip with most people being in tents and far from the stone buildings, lots were not. Dead animals were everywhere. Some people got hit in the head, got broken arms because of hail hitting there, and even a few who couldn't get away at all. What was the most touching for me, when I was small and didn't know what it was to be a parent, were the things parents did for their kids to keep them safe. Like a woman using her body as a human shield to keep her 2 kids safe when their tent collapsed, and having to be hospitalized with several injuries because of it. I'm not sure if this falls under the category of natural disaster, but when I was a kid, my house got hit by lightning. It was back in the summer of 1999, the day after my 10th birthday. I remember it vividly. It was a Saturday night, and I was having my best friend, who also happened to be my next-door neighbor, stay the night at my house. It was around midnight, and we were watching TV. All of a sudden, the TV goes off with a very loud bang, and the house goes into complete darkness. The room we were in, though, was completely undamaged. The house alarm started going off, and I heard shouting from my family. We went to investigate, but as it was so dark, it was very hard to see. My dad, who was in bed, came rushing down the stairs, and my mom shouted, "Everyone get out of the house." At this point, I still didn't fully understand what was going on. It was only when we opened the front door that I realized what had happened. In front of the door was a huge pile of rubble. Half the house basically was lying in the garden. The whole front of the house had pretty much blown off. I walked over the sharp, wet rubble with just my socks on as we all went next door to my friend's house. There were 5 of us in the house: my mom, dad, sister, my friend and I, and we were all totally unharmed, thankfully. The next morning, after the emergency services were gone, we were allowed to look inside the house. I looked in my bedroom and saw that the entire ceiling had fallen on top of my bed. If I hadn't asked if my friend could stay the night, chances are I would have been in bed. For all I know, I could have been killed. We had to move out for 6 months while our house was fixed, but I still live in that same house to this day. My mom used to joke about how house insurance was the best money she had ever spent.